Thank you so much, Yan and the University of Maryland. I'm Dr. Wilson. It's really exciting to be here for the 7th annual 10th year celebration of SIEGE. Certainly an honor to be here and truly, truly humbled to moderate this fantastic panel that's focused on Justice 40 and positioning communities to climate funding. My name is Rebecca Rehr, and I'm the Director of Climate for Health at ecoAmerica based out of Washington, D.C. I'm joining you on lands shepherded by the Piscataway people, and I am going to just turn the floor over to our speakers to introduce themselves and let you all know where they're joining us from. Thanks so much, each of you, for being here today. And we're going to start with Dr. Ana Baptista.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ana Isabel Baptista, and I'm coming to you from the ancestral land of the Lenape people. And I am an assistant professor at the New School University in New York City and co-direct the center there called the Tishman Environment and Design Center, where we do a lot of collaborative work with EJ communities. And I also serve on the board for the Ironbound Community Corporation out of my hometown in Newark, New Jersey, and the New Jersey EJ Alliance. And as a board member for the New Jersey EJ Alliance, I serve on the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, along with Harold and Dr. McClain. And so we've been doing a lot of Justice 40 work as part of the platform together. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Mr. Mustafa Ali.
Everyone, it's Mustafa Santiago Ali, coming to you from the Pamunkey and Mattapon Island. Honored to be able to hold space there. I'm the vice president at the National Wildlife Federation for Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization. I'm also the CEO and founder of Revitalization Strategies. I've been working on social justice issues since I was 16 and was blessed to, as a student at EPA, eventually become one of the founders of the Office of Environmental Justice. Spent 24 years of federal service, 22 years at EPA, and 2 years on Capitol Hill working for John Conyers when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and just blessed to be here to join with everyone.
Thank you. And over to Mr. Harold Mitchell.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Harold Mitchell. I come to you from Spartanburg, South Carolina, where I'm the founder and executive director of the ReGenesis Community Development Corporation. Served 13 years in the South Carolina legislature. Got into this work with the 2 Superfund sites and 4 brownfield sites literally in front of our house, and leveraged that into a major redevelopment that was driven by the community here in Spartanburg. And just happy to be a part of this panel and discussion. And thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know we're waiting for Dr. Mildred McClain, who's the executive director and co-founder of Harambee House, and we will welcome her as soon as she is able to join. And I would just encourage everybody, we really do have an incredible wealth of knowledge on this panel. And so please start typing your questions in now so we can make sure to get to as many as possible. We're going to run through a couple of prepared questions, but would love to hear from all of you and what you want to know. So start now with keep the chat vibrant, and we'll get to as many as we can. So the first question, really, the Justice 40 Initiative is unlike any commitment we have ever seen from the federal government with regards to funding allocated in an attempt to address systemic racism. The project has the goal of delivering 40% of the overall benefits of relevant federal investments to disadvantaged communities and tracks performance towards that goal through the establishment of an Environmental Justice Scorecard. Can you talk about the development of this initiative? Who was consulted in the creation of this policy? And maybe more importantly, who was left out of these conversations? Mustafa, let's start with you.
Well, there probably are others who are even better well-versed than myself at this, considering you have members who are actually on the WEJAC on this committee or on this particular panel. So, this comes out of a long set of work. And a number of frontline leaders have been asking the federal government, and of course state governments also, but they follow the lead of the federal government, in dedicating a set of resources that in a holistic way can address the impacts that are happening inside of our communities. So we should anchor that this is not necessarily a new concept, but it is a culmination of a number of different organizations and leaders who have said that this was necessary. It is also in alignment with what our country actually looks like, at least up until this last census set of information that came out, where we learned that there are even more folks of color in our country than had traditionally been captured by some of the mechanisms and tools that we have. So if we know that we have over 40% of the people in our country who are of color, it would just make sense that the resources would be in alignment with that. In this moment, the Justice40 Initiative gives us an opportunity to leverage the various resources. Now, we talk about benefits, and of course, I think we're going to have a conversation about that today and what that actually means. But the overall framework is a positive step in the right direction. You asked the question, was everybody consulted in relationship to this? The answer to that is no, but there were a number of people who were consulted. And as the process continues to move forward, there will be additional opportunities for folks to get engaged in the process. Of course, in the environmental justice movement, we continue to reinforce with folks that before you design something, you should have multiple sets of conversations with all kinds of different leaders and organizations. So I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleagues to take you deeper into that process.
Wonderful. Thanks, Harold. Why don't you pick it up from there? Oh, you're on mute if you just want to unmute real quick.
Sorry about that. Yes, I would say that as candidate Biden, he first came with many of the folks, as Anna stated, from the Equitable and Just Climate platform, and had that conversation before issuing anything on environmental justice. Then candidate Biden, sat and listened to all of the leaders, the frontline leaders that folks reach out to. I'm doing it. But not that person. Well, even that person, because he said he wanted to hear everybody. But, he seriously listened to folks. And I mean, Richard Moore, Bob Bullard, Dr. Cecilia, it was a group of us that Biden actually listened to. And he said he wanted to get it right. And he wasn't going to do anything without having input. And it was important to have that input from folks on the front line. And so he came back after listening to the group and is like, hey, this is what I heard you say to me of what was needed for EJ communities for addressing environmental justice and climate. And before anything was released to the public, folks got a chance to make comments before even pushing that out with the American Jobs Plan. And so I think, in all honesty, we've never seen this before of any candidate or president themselves come and have this kind of dialogue and follow up with folks on the front line. So it's an ongoing process, but I will give him a letter A for a grade for sitting and talking and getting it right from the jump start. There's a lot that's got to be, tweaked in that, but listening, I think I would give him a grade A for that.
No, that's really, I appreciate that. I think it's good to hear that. I think many of us we're wondering how the narrative that's being woven together at the federal level is going to actually look in policy and on the ground. And we can get in more to that, but it sounds like the starting line is at least authentic and asking the right questions. We can talk about implementation later. Anna, over to you to answer that first question.
I don't have a lot more to add. I think Mustafa and Harold covered it. I, as someone who had never really gotten involved very early in presidential politics, election seasons, usually in my role with EJ groups like Ironbound or the New Jersey Alliance, we were rarely, if ever, able because of capacity limitations, but also because we rarely were included in a lot of the early formulation of policy pushes for candidates. This was the first time through the equitable platform really that I saw a lot of early engagement and interest in talking to EJ frontline communities early in the process, so that there was lead up time to actually try to influence and direct some of the first 100-day actions of the Biden administration, which again, for somebody, I don't have very much experience in this field, but I was told by many folks who have much more experience that really this was a unique experience because it hadn't happened like this in the past. You know, a lot of the major big, mainstream environmental groups were often at the table, but not the EJ groups, the frontline groups. And so I think you see some of that in the Justice 40, and in the formation even of the WEJAC and the emphasis that was brought forth in the executive order that formulated the WEJAC. I think the real test is going to be, though, like, how do we keep the pressure on this administration, because there's so many other things pulling at the administration, to ensure that early commitment is followed through. And that includes involving people in the conversation. The WEJAC has great representation from EJ communities around the country, but we need to also start going out into the communities, into these regions, and engaging with people around the topics and these issues that are having tangible and real, felt impacts that need attention. So I think there's a lot more conversations that still need to happen.
Yeah, that's such an important point too, that, the right after an election or the passage of a bill or the signing of an executive order is certainly not, there's time to celebrate for sure, but it's not a time to rest on our laurels, right? It's a time to roll up your sleeves. And I think that's really even, not even with, but especially with our champions, I think that's a really important message for everyone here, is to keep up the work, keep up the pressure, as you said, because just, something being put on paper, it's about that implementation and enforcement. So I really appreciate that insight. So we've started to talk about the good starting point where we are, but then sort of, despite the groundbreaking commitment, it's fair to say, as we started to allude to, that the Justice 40 initiative has its flaws. So from your perspective, where could the program be improved? And Anna, why don't we start with you this time?
Oh boy. Well, there isn't a program yet. There's a lot of ideas, I think, but the formulation of what Justice 40 is going to be, how it will be implemented and tracked, is still being developed. I would say that, there's just the White House, they just released an interim guidance on Justice 40, and the WEJAC also released some guidance. And if you look at those two documents, and we could put them in the chat, you'll see quite a big difference, I think. And I think the difference is really in, like, we can't rely on just bean counting existing programs, like, oh, these are the existing programs we have that affect disadvantaged or, LMI households or, EJ communities. We need to think more creatively and more boldly about where we need to go to really ensure that investments make it to the communities that need it most. And looking at just the existing programs and taking a tally of those isn't going to cut it. And so I think we need a lot more ambition, in even expressing where Justice 40 is going to show up, for example, in the infrastructure bill or the reconciliation packet. Where is the Justice 40 investment and commitment explicit in any of these big spending packages? So I think there's a lot, we're going to give some room for them to develop, obviously, the metrics and the rollout of the implementation, but I think the early guidance, the interim guidance, needs to be a little bit more, I'm being generous here, but we gotta go beyond just the same old stuff, because the same old stuff didn't help, didn't get us where we wanted to go in previous administration. So I'll stop there, and I can drop in the chat some of those two reports.
Yeah, that would be great. It looks like someone already put in the White House interim guidance. So if you have the other one or both. Mustafa, you started to allude to this nuance here. Justice 40, 40% of benefits. Do you want to dig in a little more on that?
Oh, Lord, you're going to get me in trouble. Well, everybody knows I believe in real talk, so let me just give it to you. So, when we talk about benefits, that's very subjective. And of course, there are going to be criteria that are being developed by a lot of really smart people, and hopefully folks who are concerned with what's happening inside of our communities. I always use the example that if I go to the bank and I look for a loan, benefits, it's not going to get me approved for the loan. They want to know what type of capital that I have. They want to know what kind of dollars I have in my bank account. And when I think about the frontline organizations who've been doing the work for decades now, we got to make sure that they're getting real resources so that they can leverage those to continue to expand the work that's going on. So that's why one of the reasons that I worry about the benefits. So, we could say that an airshed is now there are less people who are, being impacted by whatever toxin it might be, but that's not intentionally focused on vulnerable communities. So we got to work through that, if you will. I'll just give you some other, a little bit of additional information as well. So most folks know that I led the interagency working group, which was 17 federal agencies, a couple White House offices, back when we had no money, but that's for another conversation. That there are, and Anna, she kind of took you there. There are all these other agencies and departments that are not really yet a part of the sets of opportunities that a Justice 40 initiative, when the president says he wants to take an all of government approach, that is fantastic. So where are all the international agencies? Where are all the financial agencies that are the ones that are really handling the purse strings? And then the other part that we have to think through, is that, one, this is an executive order, and we know the political dynamics that are going on inside of our country, and that we hope that we're blessed that this administration will get 4 additional years. But if they don't, it could create some problems down the road. But we have to deal with the immediacy of the moment, and I get that. Last point that I'll raise is that when you really understand, last 2 points that I have to raise. One is that the structure of existing programs, the regulations, the statutes, and those laws have never been developed in a way to be focused on moving money to African-American communities, Latinx communities, indigenous communities, Asian and Pacific Islander communities. So that creates a set of challenges that folks just don't talk enough about, so that we can get a lot of smart people thinking about it, both inside and outside the government. And the last point is that those of us who have done this work know that when the dollars leave the federal side of the equation and go to the states, the counties, and the local governments, lots of times those dollars are not utilized in the way that they were originally envisioned to be utilized. So we have to begin to think critically about what are the accountability mechanisms in the states and in the counties and on the local level. And we know that the capacity does not exist in many states across the country. So we got to figure out how we're going to get that capacity up so that we can hold people accountable. And then the other reality, if we have in real talk, is that we have a country that people put these labels on, red for certain states and blue for other states. So in those states that have never given any significant consideration to environmental justice or climate justice or civil rights, how are you going to help to move both the evolution that's necessary and at the same time the work that has to go on? And for me, if a state is not doing the right things, are you going to take the money away? Because we've never done it in the Title VI sort of construct. So, so I think about all these things. So just let me wrap it up in saying that Justice 40 is a needed initiative in this moment. It has a huge amount of value, but there are a number of parts that we have to really have some real talk about if we're going to make it become a reality on the ground where the work actually happens.
Yeah, I think you've given us lots to think about. And to what Anna was saying earlier, lots of pressure points for everybody listening to to plug in on, right? And so I appreciate that list, because now we are better prepared to weigh in when there are calls for input on implementation. So everybody should be making your list now. And so Harold, over to you. Where in your view could Justice 40 be improved?
I think Mustafa pretty much hit it. And as you just stated, the implementation process, because oftentimes we think when we hear, the $1 billion, the $1 trillion, you're doing all the white papers, the discussions on the top level. But as Mustafa stated, that's always been the problem, is implementation of those dollars leaving Washington, going into the states. And especially when you look at places when we hear folks oftentimes talk about Cancer Alley, you talk about those black belt red states that we always talk about, always lift up. But those states have red governors who are determined, as they stated with the era dollars, to make this a failed administration. So how do you get around that, where the majority of our black and brown legislators and folks at the local level, are, it's kind of like if you don't put the strings and what's necessary to get those dollars into those communities, it'll never get there. And this is something that is so new that, as was stated a little earlier, we've only looked at EPA. We never look at Treasury. We never look at HHS, those agencies that would make the biggest impact of investment in the impacted communities. And so this is something that, Mustafa stated earlier, previously when he was there at EPA, there was no money. And I will say now that, the push, and even looking hopefully with the reconciliation, the dollars, it's kind of like everything is being teed up, but someone needs to pay attention to the implementation strategy. That's my biggest concern here that we have, the interim guidance, the disadvantaged communities. I mean, even when you look back at the interim guidance, as Anna stated, I would say about 70% of the comments that came out of the WEJAC, those that President Biden said he wanted to make sure had a continued voice in this process, he created the WEJAC, kept them there at that level, making those comments. And about 70% of that is what you see in the guidance itself, that interim guidance. And, it's interim. So this is an ongoing process, to make these corrections, to look at, the hooks that's going to have to be put in with these agencies to be held accountable. And this is where, we created here in South Carolina and with the ReGenesis Institute, a Justice 40 oversight committee for the states, because I've learned this lesson as a state legislator before, that those funds are not going to come in. And we saw out of the Affordable Care Act, monies that were held back that didn't reach the ground, rural hospitals shut down, people died. And so this is real. And we have to understand that timing is everything right now.
Could I just add one thing that I think is really important? Because all of us went to school. Now, I went to school in Appalachia and in Detroit. So my math is all right, but some folks can correct me here. When we're talking about 1.5 trillion for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, when we're talking about the possibility of $3.5 trillion for the reconciliation bill, that's just a small part of the overall federal budget, right? So if we just look at those two sets of opportunities around resources, and we look at 40% of $5 trillion, and we know there's some variability in there, we're talking about somewhere between $2 trillion and $2.5 trillion, depending on how the numbers play out, that should be going toward justice. But we don't frame it that way, right? We continue to leave things, and it's still being developed, very ambiguous. So we need to set some baseline. So 40% is supposed to be a baseline. It's not supposed to be the ceiling. But if we don't make sure that our mindset is a 21st century mindset that is looking toward the 22nd century, right? There are people who are on this call, some of the younger ones, who will be knocking on the door of the 22nd century. Myself and others might not be around at that time. But that is the difference, right? In the environmental justice movement, we are so used to doing so much with so little that we often shrink down, or will allow others to shrink down. And in this moment, in a moment that there really is abundance, because if we had longer, we could go into the dollars that go to the Department of Defense, Army, Navy, the Marines, so forth and so on. What role will they play in this space? We can look at the dollars that go to NASA. What role will they play in this space? Because it's all connected. Because when we have these conversations, we understand that you can't win on climate change if you don't win on environmental justice. So these are two major components that the administration has said that they are going to be all in and that they're going to focus on. So that's why I say we have to, one, better educate folks on the vehicles, two, be looking for opportunities to expand. For me, 40% is not enough, considering trillions of dollars of wealth was snatched out of the African-American community, the Latinx community, the indigenous community, and we can verify that in the history of our country. This is a transformational moment. The president has reinforced that, and I believe that it is also. And in a transformational moment, that means that we can't think in small boxes, as Anna said, that people just want to check these boxes. It has to be. And I understand that there's a lot of work that goes into that to build the capacity in the federal government to be able to navigate that, and then through the other governments that are necessary. So I'll stop there, because I want us to have a much more expansive way of looking at this, so that we don't get into a positioning where people begin to shrink this and shrink this and shrink this. And when we turn around and look, we've lost out on a number of additional dollars that should have been a part of the process.
And I think that needs to be a larger part of the national narrative right now, that 40% is a baseline. I think that's the first time I've heard someone frame it like that. And it brings a new concern to my mind that people are looking at it as a cap rather than a baseline.
Yeah.
Well,
and so I want to stress that point, that it's a baseline, and it's a minimum. This is the minimum requirement. And so I think that's a really important point. And the next question is really about how our communities, what are the mechanisms by which communities can access the funding? I mean, we've talked a little bit about, the funding allocated by the federal government. And then of course there's implementation on the state and local level, but communities haven't necessarily, all communities don't have capacity to apply for federal grants, for example. Federal grants have a very cumbersome application process and reporting process. And so, and like it's already been stated, we can't just use existing infrastructure within the federal government. We can't just use existing programs, because there have been ways that those have not worked, or it's not enough. So, if you look at something like a federal grant application, that's probably not going to work for accessing funds for Justice 40. So what are your recommendations, for the way that this money can effectively reach the communities where it needs to be reached, the communities it's meant for, in its intention? So Harold, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I would say too, you have to look at some of the best practices where communities have used this, and there are communities around the country that have been able to do this access, and understanding most of these dollars, where I'm hearing some people when they're talking about the infrastructure of, the lead pipes, the water pipes, water and sewer systems. That's not something that a community and a nonprofit is going to be able to apply for, but the communities can be a part of the Department of Labor when they do the job training for that work, from a workforce standpoint. With the lead pipes, who owns the pipes? It's the local government, not the nonprofit. So you got to understand what you can access first and foremost. The pandemic has taught us where access to healthcare, this is something that communities could apply and receive those funding. So I think, this is one of those things in the process of understanding what grants, what initiatives, what programs that the communities can apply for and access, and being able to create those plans at the local level is another important part of this. And this is just something that is just new to everybody, because, for so long, communities have been cut off. Now you're given the keys to a Bentley, and you're expected to know where all dollars are in each one of the agencies. And hell, many of the agencies themselves don't even know around the table what's in the coffers of, you know, various agencies that could be impactful for most of these communities that we see that we're trying to get this investment into.
Yeah, and Anna, why don't you pick it up from there?
Yeah, you know, I worked for over a decade of the community grassroots nonprofit in EJ Group Ironbound Community. And there we, even though we were a small EJ organization, we were able to get things like EJ Small grants and EPA CARE grants and Brownfields grants. And even with larger grants that like DERA, the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act grants, that was money that went to the Port Authority or the city of Newark. But in their application process, they were required to show what community partners they had. And that would count towards whether or not they had local support for their project. And it was the few times that community groups worked with somebody like a Port Authority because we had aligned goals around reducing diesel emissions in our communities. So I think we need more of a requirement, an eligibility requirement for large grants that go to state or local entities, their community groups can't access, that there's a requirement in the eligibility that you have to have local buy-in and support to get that money and access to that funding. And we need more money that local grassroots groups can in fact access, okay? Because I think if we give communities the support, those organizations the support, for example, liaisons with technical assistance, for example, our HBCUs, our community colleges, are the institutions that can partner with local groups or even federal agency liaisons that can provide some additional capacity to access grants directly. Because when community groups can access grants directly, they can have a huge impact. For example, we were able to hire local residents to do energy efficiency audits in homes that were never before reached by utilities. And we did it at a fraction of the price that the utility was doing it. And they were accessing all the community development block grant money. We were subcontractors. And so, community groups can do a lot with funding, but we need more than EJ small grants. We don't want small grants. We need big grants. We need EJ big grants. Like $25,000 is not going to cut it. And I totally second what Mustafa was saying, this mentality of abundance, because I'm hearing even now with trillions of dollars on the table, committees telling me, don't worry, the justice, distribution will happen later. We don't have to put that here explicitly. And we know that that is cold assurance to communities that have often been told, don't worry, the equity will trickle down eventually. We need to really demand that those carve outs, that floor is baked into the eligibility, into every bit of money that's coming out, or we're going to get, left for the after effect. So I really feel strongly right now we need to be advocating with our local congressional delegation, our agencies. Like, we want to see where is the explicit commitment to the money, the dollars that are going to come to our community, and put it in writing in agency policy.
Rebecca, can I piggyback back on her just for 1 second though, but close those loopholes, and not just look at the freaking EPA, because a $20,000 small grant is not going to make it. You can get more of a cleanup dollars out of HUD, out of the CDBG, and have direct access to communities. And that's why I'm saying a dashboard needs to be created. And this is one thing that I will say at the beginning of this administration, looking at the DOT dashboard, they saw that there was some $80 million left over from the Trump administration, but it's like, who knew anything about that? And so I think the transparency piece of this, understanding and create the type of, the type of oversight and transparency that we hear the other side talk about all the time, put this in place and you'll see those dollars make it to those communities. That's the thing that we have to do, is close the freaking loopholes. I mean, this buffet is set up. The resources we're talking about coming, but we have to make sure that we can access and quit cutting fence line EJ communities off from the economic conversation. It's like when you put environmental justice or climate justice, we close everything off and you're leaving out the economic justice argument that too oftentimes communities are left out of.
Yeah, and Mustafa.
I mean, there are, I forget the last set of numbers that I saw. There are thousands of different types of grant programs that move throughout the federal government and a number of state governments. You have to build environmental justice criteria and intentionality inside of that. And then you've got to also help people to have the capacity. So I want to applaud I don't know all of the incubator programs and accelerator programs that are out there trying to actually help folks to be prepared for what's coming, because that's critically important. There are a number of organizations who've navigated this, but there are all kinds of others who have not yet, especially at the level that we're talking about, especially as you begin to expand this. So we gotta get that part right. Here's the other part that we don't talk enough about, is that as a part of these sets of resources, there are going to be contracting and subcontracting opportunities. And the reality of the situation is, if you really understand the federal structure and you look at how many people of color are actually certified in that space compared to the other population, it is minuscule. So once again, if we are not doing the prep work beforehand to help people to start their own businesses who are authentic in this space, there's another huge set of resources that are going to be missed. What happens when dollars come into a program and it's tied to contracting and subcontracting? They have to be utilized. If they don't, then you can't justify the additional resources you need in the next budgeting cycle. So we got to make sure that that's right. Here's another piece, since we're going to go ahead and make sure we're having a master's and a PhD set of conversations around this. The other part that you have to understand also is that a huge amount of this money that is going to be focused on environmental justice is also tied to the clean economy. Right now, when we talk about the clean economy, less than 2% of the businesses are owned by people of color, African Americans, Latinx, and Indigenous brothers and sisters. If we know that, then once again, we've got this huge set of opportunities, but we've got a gap by not doing everything. And that's where public-private partnerships can also come into the space, and helping folks to get in or to expand and to better understand how to do this. So all that being said, and I could go into a whole bunch of other examples. Let me give you one more example. So if I was still back in the federal government, and I'm glad I got my freedom papers and I'm outside doing what I do, is that you have these amazing sets of projects that have been going on, driven by people of color, that should give people a North Star. Of course, everybody hears me talk about the North Star has to be focused on justice. A part of that justice is showing people that these folks who have been able to do it. You have two who are on the screen right now. The ReGenesis project, taking that small $20,000 grant, leverage $300 million. The work that's been going on by Anna's organization in Jersey, Ironbound. You've got Miss Margaret May and the Ivanhoe community in Kansas City. You got the work of Diane Takvorian and Carolina Martinez out the Environmental Health Coalition. You have the faith-based examples of New Bethel in the South Side of Chicago, or the work of Reverend Floyd Flake up in Jamaica, Queens, or Buster Suarez, some of the work that he did over in Jersey City. And I can go around the country. I say all this to say that when we share with folks that resources are coming, whether through a climate lens or an environmental justice lens, even though they're both brother and sister, if you will, that you also should have out front these organizations and the work that they did, so folks across the country can say, I see why these resources are needed and how they can create transformative change. Then you get more people behind it, and it makes it much more difficult for the detractors to find traction, because you've shown what America looks like and what is possible when you get the resources into the hands of the folks on the local level. And of course, you got to have partnerships with cities and counties and others, but the central part has to be community led. And then we got something to talk about.
And I wanted to stay on this for a minute because we got a good question in the chat about sort of urban and rural areas, and that, or more and less densely populated areas, that in the environmental justice distribution of funds, a lot of the urban areas, the more densely populated areas, take up a lot of the attention and the dollars. And so the question really is, how do we make sure that smaller municipalities with limited infrastructure and rural communities aren't missed in Justice 40? And specifically giving the examples in Washington and Oregon, Seattle and Portland get a lot of the attention. How can we make sure that the rest of the state where there are EJ communities get attention? And I'll perfectly happy to admit my urban bias. I am an urban environmentalist. I am from Baltimore City Public Schools, lead in the pipes. That was my introduction to environmental justice. And I fully admit and am always learning, because I have an urban bias. I live through the lens. I'm a city girl, right? And I'm always learning. There are the different needs in rural communities and the different, and I'm always learning. And so I appreciate that question, because I hands down fully admit to having that grown up in that and having that lens. And so just, really interested in your take on how to make sure, less populations with a little less infrastructure, fewer people get that, are benefiting from these funds equally.
I think Mr. Ali and Anna, since I'm from the country, the big city folks, I'll just chime this in and they can chew. But, this is one of the things that we see oftentimes from Washington, and then when you get to the local level, is that rural communities in rural America, they're always left out, because the dollars are going to what is pumping money into states, driving their economies. So the rural sector often gets left out of this, which is why with the Justice 40 oversight that we have here in South Carolina and what was passed in Delaware, we have several other states that have jumped on, stated, we have identified the problems, the needs, and the people on the ground, they're well aware, the communities, they know where the gaps are. And as we saw here, we talk about broadband. This pandemic has really shown us where we've kicked the can down the road and haven't invested. This is giving us an opportunity to connect the dots to those disadvantaged communities, because like here in South Carolina, for a year and a half, kids were not in school, not access to broadband, and the remote learning, that didn't happen. So this is an easy conversation for folks at the local level and the state level to see, hey, this is an opportunity for us to be able to get broadband in, tackle and tack USDA, which is a one that oftentimes we don't look at, and plug them in with the Department of Energy for this broadband access. But I would say again, until the implementation, closing those loopholes, you're going to have this. I mean, I think we have a structure that's being put together, but this input is what needs to take place between now and the next couple of months to make sure as it gets out, because if you let this out of Washington without the guardrails, I guarantee you're going to get steamrolled. And those resources are not going to make the communities that it's intended to go into, and what the president has stated was part of his priority. So, that's why I'm glad to be a part of this conversation, especially loving to hear Mr. Ali and Anna, from the urban sectors, talk about how they're going to help us poor rural folks.
Anna, you want to handle that?
Yeah, we have some rural areas in Jersey. They're not many, but there are some. We do have a whole South Jersey.
What you consider rural in New York is probably a metropolitan complex.
You're right, though, Harold. You're right. The density we live with is very different, and I think we need to pay special attention to rural communities and have built into Justice 40, the metrics, some of the things that people were talking about in terms of developing the new tool and the new screen for identifying areas that need, that are either called disadvantaged or EJ communities or overburdened. One of the layers we need is communities under 10,000 people or dispersed communities with special characteristics that will not be captured typically using sort of the standard approach of looking at the demographics, right? Because maybe there's not enough people, or the people are dispersed in a specific way. You're not going to capture them by census tract necessarily. And so sometimes those communities sort of, they completely fall off our radar screen in terms of, being hotspots in terms of needing particular resources. So I think building that in early in the design of Justice 40, and then in figuring out how do we connect with local communities that know the needs the best, because oftentimes if you rely on even the regional federal agency offices, they may not always know where those pockets are and needs are. So one of the recommendations we had made early on for Justice 40 is the development of like regional and local hubs of advisors, with grassroots members, EJ organizational members that could help give guidance on the implementation of Justice 40, ensure that there's proper engagement at that level. So that's one of the recommendations that we hope will get implemented that helps with that.
Let me dispel some false narratives. First false narrative. I was raised in a community of 500 people, where Harold was raised in a community of at least a few thousand people. So we only had one stop sign, Harold. Y'all had some stop lights. So I know a little bit about being country. But getting back to what we need to talk about real quickly is the fact that, again, these false narratives. So 54% of our indigenous brothers and sisters, Native Americans, live in rural communities. They're dealing with environmental injustices. A quarter, 25% of people of color live in rural areas. We often don't get the attention, but that's the reality. And of course, environmental injustice also impacts lower wealth white communities as well. So when we allow these walls to be built between communities, between urban and rural, once again, that's that old model that they taught us sometimes in grad school or in undergrad or in other places, where the pie is only so large, so we have to pit things against each other, and that there's not enough resources to go around. I worked long enough in the federal government, both in federal agencies and on Capitol Hill handling appropriations, to tell you that the resources are there. The question is about prioritization, right? Because it is all connected. That same pollution that is making people sick and shortening their lives in urban communities, it's the same pollution that is warming up the oceans and the planet. It's that same pollution that's drying, causing all these droughts, creating the wildfires that are in rural areas. That pollution then makes it back to Black and brown communities and continues this cycle that's going on. So that's why I say that we cannot separate each other. We have to make sure that we're making investments. All the natural infrastructure dollars benefit folks in the cities as well, because they get the drinking water from what's going on in that space, and a number of other dynamics. So that's why I say that the resources are there. Anna shared with you that metrics are being built. And so it's so critically important that we don't allow the powers to be to separate us. And we make sure that the dollars get to the communities that have often been unseen and unheard. Catherine Flowers shared with us, and many other in the EJ space, about the crumbling infrastructure or non-existent infrastructure throughout the Black Belt. But we know that the same thing is going on in some of our urban centers, and it is also going on reservations and other places that our indigenous brothers and sisters are residing. So it is all connected. And that's why we have to have a holistic set of strategies and the dollars that are going to meet this moment. That's why we can't allow people to continue to try and put these wedges between us, right? And we do have to make sure that our rural communities are finally receiving the dollars that are necessary, because it benefits the urban areas as well.
Yep.
And I really just appreciate all those answers. And I know, like everyone tuning in, you're just giving us lots to think about and lots to do, which I appreciate. The next, I really wanted to ask about mapping tools, updated mapping tools that are included in the Justice 40 Initiative. The project proposes an updated mapping tool based on EPA EJSCREEN, as well as a climate and economic justice screening tool. So what do these tools need to include in order to ensure that EJ communities are benefiting from them? And what indicators and measures are crucial to ensure that funding is being allocated to those who need it most? So think about that, but I'm going to combine it with a question in the chat, which is, what are your thoughts on the current characterization of disadvantaged communities? Do you think it needs to be changed, better described, expanded? So sorry, our mapping tools, and the definition of disadvantaged communities and helping allocate the benefits of this program. And I'll just add a bit of commentary, moderator privilege, is that most often I hear from communities, the last thing I need is another indicator to tell me that I need additional funding and support from the federal government. So how are we hearing communities when they say, I'll point you in the direction that shows where our community needs funding, and then having to sort of prove with a number of mapping layers or, quantitative indicators that the funding is needed in the communities. And I'm always feeling a tension there between what the community is saying they need and how they prove it, and sort of what the federal government requires to prove it. And so that's a broad sort of set of ideas, but I'm seeing that in the chat and in the question. So if anybody wants to go first, the floor is yours. I know I got to call on people. It never works. So Harold, do you want to go first?
No, I was wanting to hear Dr. Ali. That's why I signed up for the session.
Well, so I've never labeled our communities as disadvantaged. There have been disinvestments, intentional, systemic racism built into policy, driving that disinvestment in our communities. What we have to do is, how do we help our communities to be thriving, right? So that is what we should be focused upon. And we should have thriving initiatives so that whatever are the elements that communities say will help them to be in that space, then that's what we begin to move into that direction. It's really tough, and that's why we have to be honest with folks. There is a structure that exists. That structure has been around for hundreds of years now, and it's been built upon, and very few times were our ideas a part of those building blocks. So we're in this moment now where we have some opportunities and resources that are moving, but we've got a system that was never designed for our communities to be able to thrive. W.E.B. Du Bois, some folks should look up one of his quotes that talks about a system that was never created for you can't fail you. That's a scary set of observations from a great thinker of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So we are at the same time trying to figure out, how do we utilize, and when opportunities present themselves, dismantle, deconstruct, rebuild pieces of this, because we're not going to be able to rebuild the whole system. And folks got to be honest with people about this. So that's why, one, language and narratives are important, right? So if we are coming from a point of non-abundance, then that's what people are going to think through. And that's going to be the paradigm that they operate from. And that's why I say we have to be focused on, what does it take to help our communities to be whole, complete, and to be able to thrive. And when we come from that mindset, and then that set of framing, which Anna and Harold and all these other incredible folks who are part of these different vehicles that are in place are trying to get in place, to get that accountability in place, but to expand the accountability to, these are just a set of actions, but there's so much more that we expect as we build this out over, hopefully, toward the end of 2030, because 2030 is the flashpoint where we will know a whole lot about a whole lot. If we did it right, or if we left these gaps that are going to then make everybody coming at each other, because resources will shrink and shrink and shrink in a number of different ways, from air and water and a number of other things. So that's my quick response to that, which wasn't as quick as I meant it to be.
It was good.
Anna?
How do you follow that? Mustafa really said it. And we get caught up in a lot of these conversations about metrics and tools. And the reality is, coming from a place like New Jersey, where we just passed an EJ law in New Jersey. And unlike California, we didn't have a mapping tool we didn't have an indicator tool, but we, as EJ advocates said, let's pass the policy and then build the tool, believing fully that this is not rocket science. We actually have tools, we have data, we know where the EJ communities are, and best believe we will, now that we have the policy, because oftentimes we spend so much time building the tools, we never get around to how do you actually use the tool for impact? Because it's not enough to build a perfect tool. You have to know, well, what is it for? What is its intended purpose? And so I think the tools are really important for accountability, because if the commitment is Justice40 as a floor, how will we as communities be assured that that's actually happening, that the not just the investments, but what we call benefits, are our communities getting improvements, better air quality, cleaner water, better health outcomes? We need to have some metrics, and those metrics can be created. The data exists, the tools exist, and we've got a lot of recommendations about the kinds of indicators there, and they're not just quantitative. There are a lot of qualitative indicators, historical indicators, for example, about what communities were redlined and disenfranchised, that were the subject of discrimination. And so those are the kinds of things you can map and also put into place alongside quantitative indicators. But that's just one piece of it. We asked about the definitions part. That's another area of a lot of work group conversations here. Harold, you're not in that work group. I'm in a work group that, all we do is talk about how are we going to put really clear definitions and recommendations for definition about how you define environmental justice communities, overburdened communities, which are different and sometimes conflated. So there's a lot of conversation about the purpose and the context of the use of definitions, and even the definition of benefits. Mustafa hinted at that. Is there's a lot of attention on funding and investments, which is really important. But one of the things we've been hearing from our communities in New Jersey is, well, what about improving the conditions on the ground, air quality, public health, the condition of our housing, so making tangible impacts on things that are impacting people's health and well-being is also going to be important to measure and to see whether we're making improvements. There are some suggestions, and I can post them in the chat box, that we've been working on in terms of recommendations about definitions and recommendations about indicator tools that lots of folks have been weighing in on, including the WEJAC. WEJAC's guidance has a lot of great in-depth consideration of both of those things.
It'll be really important to have that from the federal government, because I've seen it happen on the state level where opposition uses lack of clear definitions or uses conflation of terms to thwart environmental justice efforts. They're very effective at that.
The use of race is another, issue, because, and I'm sure Mustafa and Harold can speak to this as well. The experience has been that there's a fear of using race as a category for defining communities because of legal challenges. But there's things we can still do, even if, and by the way, in many states like New Jersey and New York, we use race in our definition. We haven't gotten sued yet, but we'll see.
Oh yeah, and that's the tension I was talking about, right? Because you spend a lot of time working on definitions, and communities are saying, we know what this is. We know what this is. Like, stop spending years defining this, but then again, if you don't have that on paper and don't have the clear guardrails and direction, opposition swoops in very quickly and absolutely uses that to thwart any initiatives.
But Rebecca, we don't have months to create clear definitions when we know what the problems are, because we're going to be in a midterm by the time we finish defining something. And if we don't have some tangible examples of what Justice40 has benefited, I guarantee you everything that's been built up, this vehicle, and looking at the kind of resources to get to these communities, I mean, I've heard Mustafa say it a couple times on MSNBC, you know, this is a unique time and opportunity that we have. And if we miss it, we miss this opportunity that we have right now with the vehicles created, the resources there to move us. I mean, we saw what the Industrial Revolution did. Now we're talking about a renewable. And here's the opportunity to create those real jobs, look at entrepreneurship, you know, really empower communities. You know, we have it now, but there is a problem. And to the other two panels, and I don't mean to take over your moderator role, but, you know, we have a problem with regional and agencies in silos that feel that, hey, when you mention the word environmental justice, that really doesn't mean me. And we saw this here in South Carolina when we tried to create an interagency process at the state level. And it was only until the fourth meeting that we began to look at definitions and the missions of the agencies. And then it's like, oh yeah, that's what we do. It's like, hell, that's what we're talking about. And so it's a mindset that I know the president says he wants to go across the board, but there's going to have to be some work there as well. I mean, this is a lot of work that's got to be done of changing mindsets and looking at the, you know, really, I mean, it's the economics of this, because other folks are going to look at it and try to capitalize on disadvantaged communities. And that's where that language and words matter. We saw what the opportunity zones did, the opportunist zones that took over a lot of Black and brown communities and Superfund and Brownfield, how Donald Trump stated that that was the greatest thing he did for Black people. But we see where those benefits lie and who actually benefited from it.
Yeah, and really making sure that all of government approach is implemented is a theme I think I've heard from all of you. I mean, it blew my mind when I found out that there's no environmental health indicator that's used in the placement of federally qualified health centers. When I was working on that program implementation at the local level, having been fresh out of graduate school under the tutelage of Dr. Jacoby Wilson, and knowing what I know about environmental influences on health outcomes, we need to have health promoting infrastructure in areas where there's higher exposure to environmental contaminants, but it's not part of the geographic definition of a federally qualified health center. Mm-hmm. And just that to me, again, fresh out of grad school, thinking I knew it all, couldn't believe that wasn't part of how we place healthcare providers in communities. And Mustafa, do you want to say something before we have to wrap it up? My only moderator privilege is that we have to wrap it up. My only responsibility is that we have to end on time.
So I want to fix the gaps that are in the system, because if we don't fix the gaps, then we're going to have this cascading set of problems that come down the road. So let me just talk real quickly about some of the gaps that we can fix. So I think we would agree that there are a huge amount of environmental justice experts across the country. So let's look at our federal government. Right now, when I left, I was the only senior advisor for environmental justice for the entire federal government, of course, and I was sitting at EPA at that time. Now, EPA is making some moves to make sure that they get their thing together. But the rest of these federal agencies, there's no senior advisors for environmental justice who 24 hours a day are working with their administrators or secretaries to help to translate these things and to make sure that the voices of communities are all over the federal government, right? So if you don't have that, you got a gap. So I'm just sharing with folks that there's a gap, they can fix it. Doesn't even cost that much money to fix it. There's all kinds of great folks out there. Everybody knows Capitol Hill is playing a huge role in what's going to happen around Justice40. There are some amazing congressmen and senators who are working on the issues. But when you look at the committees, there's no folks who are there who are leading at the committee level who have serious environmental justice expertise and sets of work that come from that. So we can fix that, right? Folks just have to go out and find the right folks and then get them in. So if we're not doing that on the federal level, then we see the state where the money's going to go. And we know that there are only a handful of states that actually have some committees in place. But to have senior leadership who's talking to the governor and helping the governor around budgeting decisions and policy decisions to make sure that what the front lines is asking for is actually being translated in a way that it becomes reality. So federal level gaps, state level gaps, county level, of course there are gaps because the counties have even less resources. So you got to figure out how you're going to fix that and how you're going to get the expertise into that. And then on the local level where everything really happens, once again, you don't have that expertise that's there. Locally, hopefully they are better connected and closer to the front lines, so the front lines are playing a significant role in helping them to do that. So those are basic things that we could fix literally in a short amount of time. You got to do your due diligence, make sure you go out and get the right people for all these different types of positions, but we just got the gaps. So if we're serious about justice, if we're serious about environmental justice and climate justice, then give it the prioritization that it deserves and get the right people into the positions who can help you to win, because we all want folks to win because our lives are literally tied to us winning.
What a great note, I think, to end on, and a charge to all of us to be part of the process. Harold, Anna, any few seconds to wrap up? Great.
Thank you for the invitation, and all of you, call your congressional reps and push them on Justice 40. Call those, CEQ, and tell them that we need Justice 40, not to forget about that as a priority.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of you, everyone who joined the session today, our phenomenal panel. Thank you so much. And thank you to Dr. Wilson and Yan and team for everything you're doing to host this several days of robust conversation and action on environmental justice and health disparities. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And thank you, Rebecca, for a brilliant moderation of these very powerful panelists. I know you were hard pressed to kind of keep them on time, but you did it. And thank you, panelists, very much for participating. I got my applause here.
Okay. Hey, Michael, are we off live now?
So this room will turn over to the next set of sessions, which in this room, it'll be 30 years on youth leaders reflections on growing up in the EJ movement. So if that's not where you want to be, you'll want to exit this room, go back to Huva and look at the agenda and see where you want to go next. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thank you, Michael. It's easy when you got Mustafa Ali here. You just throw the microphone to Mustafa.
You need to stop.
We had it easy, Harold.
Yeah, very easy.
Yeah, I figure I can take the heat because I don't want y'all to get in trouble with the powers that be. So, and it's simple stuff.
I'll stop the recording.
There you go.